Rev 250 speaker series this year. I'm Elizabeth Tatum, and I'm the director of Historic Red Hook. I would like to do some shout outs before we get started. If you are a trustee of Historic Red Hook, please raise your hand. And I'm muted online, so thank you for letting me know. Trustees, we've got a few in this room. Thank you so much for supporting our programming all year. And I'm just going to make a quick adjustment. One moment. We've got people back home that like to make sure that they can hear us. So, 1 second.
We're not on in this spillover room either.
Okay, thank you. I need to, where's that button? Okay, hang on. We're going to stop sharing for a second. And turning on the audio so people back home can hear us, and okay, there we go. How does it sound in the other room out there? Can you hear us? Good? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we have someone. Okay, great. Sorry for that. Let me just try one more time here. And bring back my presentation. Great, okay. Take two. So thank you, trustees, for acknowledging yourselves. Volunteers, HRH volunteers, past and present. I know we have a lot in this room. If you just give a little wave. Thank you for all of your help running this event. We have our innkeeper here. You can see her. Ellen Phelan is responsible for opening the building when we have events, and when you have your private events. We couldn't do it without her. I'd like to acknowledge a few officials that we have in the room. We have our county historian, Will Tatum. Thank you. It is thanks to the County of Dutchess that we were able to do this program this year, so I just want to do a quick thank you. This year we did a full speaker series this fall, and then we also did a town-wide mailer. So overall, we've interacted with around 6,000 residents in Red Hook, and we had around 550 people attending the speaker series event. So really wonderful to have the support from the county, and we're looking forward to applying for more funding next year for 2026, which is the big year everybody's looking forward to, 250 years of the Declaration of Independence. We're talking about our programming on our programs committee, so if you're curious about getting involved in planning those types of events, let us know. We'd love to have you. And I just want to make sure I recognize all the town officials. I don't know who else is here today, but if you're a town official or anybody else who feels important, raise your hand. We have, I'm seeing a nod from over here. Okay. Oh, thank you. Christine is sitting right next to our other official. Thank you. A few announcements about our last events of the year. We are partnering, Stark Blooms is hosting a wreath making workshop here on December 2nd, which should be really nice, so you can register on their website. Then on December 4th, we're hosting a kitchen table conversation for the town comprehensive plan. The town is undergoing a planning process, and these are informal conversations that anybody can host. They have materials on their website about how you can host those, but we are hosting a small one here in the Elmendorf, and if you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website to sign up. We also have a member of the town planning committee. If you'd like to speak to them, I can point them out to you afterwards. This is really to make sure that everybody's voices are heard in this planning process, so that's why we're hosting a conversation here. It also goes really well with in the spirit of this space as a tavern and a civic incubator, which you'll be hearing a lot about from our presenter. And then finally, we have our holiday open house on December 7th, and that will be from 1 to 4 p.m., which is always a really wonderful event. Mikey, the baker from Tivoli, comes all the way from Tivoli in order to light up the fire, and he makes meat pies and apple pies all in the Beehive oven. It's a really wonderful event. We have students from the local schools doing music and other local musicians, so it should be a really nice time. Okay, so that is what we have. Oh, and just a last plug that our organization is completely volunteer-based. Aside from me being a part-time staff member, we have a board of 11 trustees and over 260 members who make what we do possible. So there are a lot of different ways you can get involved with Historic Red Hook, by making a donation, by volunteering your time, or becoming a member. You can go to our website at historicredhook.org/donate, volunteer, or become a member. And I see the note, I'll help with the volume levels in a moment.
Okay.
It's a manual control that has to be turned on the speakers in that room.
Oh, okay, I'll do it.
Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker who came all the way from Florida today to be with us. We're very privileged to have her. Kirsten E. Wood is a published author and professor of history at the Florida International University. Her research explores the social and political history of the early U.S., including the role of taverns in shaping public discourse. She holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has written extensively on power and gender in the early republic. And just to note, Oblong Books is here today selling Dr. Wood's book, and if you'd like to get a signed copy, stay afterwards and go take a look at the table in the middle room. So I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Wood. Let me make sure that I have her slides up. Full screen. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna go run tech stuff in the other room.
Okay, so I'm gonna be juggling. I think someone's going to tell me if the mic's at the right level, if I have to adjust the mic down. Just down. Down, yeah, all right. I'm a little shorter than Elizabeth. Those in the Zoom may not realize this, but those in the room definitely know. Okay, I'm not used to this business. So, okay. All right, so I'm really happy to be here and I hope to share some of the ideas from my book today. My book speaks to a period when taverns were far more than places to drink, gather with friends, or spend the night during travel. In the decades following the American Revolution, taverns remained sites of political mobilization as they had been from the start of the American colonies' conflict with Great Britain and indeed even before. Taverns also became increasingly significant to American economic innovation and territorial expansion in the early 19th century. And because of taverns' importance to Americans' pursuits of happiness, their individual and collective economic and territorial ambitions in particular, taverns' political functions expanded remarkably in the same period. Taverns became places to define, restrict, test, and stretch the day-to-day boundaries of belonging in the new republic. And taverns' expansive responsibilities were chiefly, but not only, available to white men. By the 1840s and 1850s, roughly the end of the period I study, the US had become markedly more democratic for white men, thanks in no small part to things like partisan competition, print culture, and the process of establishing republican institutions in which taverns themselves played no small part. But middle-class white women, usually seen as enemies of tavern culture, and also Black Americans, who were often the targets of tavern regulation and tavern violence, also used taverns for their own purposes. Acting both as individuals and collectively, all three groups helped shift American political culture in more democratic directions, albeit often with different and even competing understandings of that democracy. To put it another way, taverns were both vectors and theaters for American pursuits of mobility, economic opportunity, and Republican self-rule. People's access to and activities in taverns reflected and affected their degree of inclusion in the Republic generally. Or, in more colloquial terms, what happened in taverns didn't stay in taverns. To make this case, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the themes in my book, some of the arguments I make about taverns and transportation improvements, the spreading culture of gentility, trade and economic development, and politics. I'm also going to try to give you a bit of the flavor of some of the sources I use, such as newspaper advertisements, images, and personal correspondence. And I'm going to look both at and well beyond the Hudson Valley. So this audience probably doesn't need me to define taverns, but just in case, it's important to know that at the beginning of the 19th century, every state licensed tavern keepers to sell alcohol by the drink, that is to say, as opposed to by the quart or gallon to take away with you, and required tavern keepers to provide food and drink and shelter for travelers and their horses or cattle, their livestock. As keepers of houses for the public, i.e. public houses, tavern keepers were also expected to maintain public order. In a nutshell, this meant things like ensuring customers didn't bankrupt themselves through buying too much liquor or gambling their fortunes away. It also meant that tavern keepers were supposed to make sure somehow that tavern patrons didn't disturb the neighborhood with excessive drunkenness, excessive violence, obvious prostitution, blasphemy, and profaning the Sabbath. Lastly, it didn't mean, by the way, that taverns had to be totally closed on Sundays. Taverns could be open because they had to serve travelers, but you had to be traveling on legitimate business. You couldn't just be happening to travel in your own neighborhood and stopping at the tavern. So yeah, people were trying to police that, particularly here in New York and New England. Lastly, tavern keepers were responsible for policing certain categories of people. Enslaved people, indentured servants, apprentices, miners, soldiers, and sailors. All of these groups could only patronize taverns with the permission of their legal masters or superiors. Interestingly, women as such were nowhere barred from taverns. Where they were excluded legally, it was through provisions upholding servitude and slavery and those concerning prostitution. So by the mid-19th century, a wide variety of taverns could be found in the United States. Some were very simple one-room log cabins, perhaps with a partial loft upstairs, in which cooking, eating, drinking, sleeping all took place in the same room, both guests and the tavern-keeping family. Unhappy travelers, sometimes disparaged, okay, slide in advance. Help! Okay, touchpad doesn't work. Oh, that one, okay. It's left to right, not up and down, sorry. Okay, so travelers often disparage this kind of one-room tavern as being worse than a dog kennel, quote unquote. The quotation on the slide says something similar at greater length. When ministers and public officials looked at that kind of tavern, they often assumed these establishments were mere, quote, tippling houses, with drunks for patrons and criminals for keepers. On the wrong side of the law or not, however, humble men also came to taverns, not only to drink, but also to share information, pool their resources, and mobilize their social and political capital, however scant it might be, just like respectable and wealthy men did. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the dog kennel, we find elaborate, large, and increasingly expensive accommodations like the two shown on the slide now. So-called first-class public accommodations could be urban or rural, but they typically served middle-class and wealthy patrons. Some had dozens, like the Merchant Hotel, or hundreds, like the Marine Pavilion, of bedrooms. And they had a host of specialized rooms: dining rooms, parlors, reading rooms, smoking rooms. They might, in the case of the more rural resorts, have activities you could do outside as well, like bowling greens. First-class hotels sought to make themselves welcoming to families and to female travelers, which distinguished them in some important ways from some taverns. And the welcome to women is suggested in these two drawings. If you look closely, you can see women on the balcony at the Merchant's Hotel and also women on the ground of the Marine Pavilion in Rockaway, Long Island. So, unsurprisingly, most taverns fell somewhere on the spectrum between the dog kennel and the first-class hotel. And for much of its history in the early Republic, the Elbendorf Inn landed in that middle range, allowing for some differentiation between the tavern household and the guests, and between different kinds of activities. Local patrons of a typical, more rural wayside tavern, such as the Spread Eagle Tavern, about a day to the northwest out of Philadelphia, would have included small-scale farmers, craftsmen, agricultural laborers, and maybe a handful of local grandees, big landowners, for example. Its traveling patrons ranged from peddlers and wagoners to prosperous leisure travelers, lawyers, merchants, government officials who would come by private carriage or stagecoach. In contrast to a place like the Spread Eagle Tavern, the Elmendorf Inn, because of its location close to the Hudson River and on a post road, and Red Hook's residents more generally would have enjoyed the benefits of being relatively close to New York City in commercial terms and tied to the traffic that was going back and forth up to Albany as well. Looking far to the south, we can see some similarities and differences. Isaac Frazier's advertisement for his tavern in Columbia, South Carolina. If you don't know Columbia geography, South Carolina geography, Charleston is here on the coast, and so Columbia is up in the interior. That dot's not the right place. Columbia's over here. Not quite sure what happened with my Google map. So Isaac Frazier's advertisement for his tavern in Columbia, South Carolina tells us that he did steady business with drovers who brought herds of horses, mules, and hogs destined for local markets, whether as draft animals or as meat. But Frazier also had, quote, appropriate rooms elegantly furnished, which would have been for gentlemen cotton planters and their families from the cotton districts around Columbia. This combination suggests some incongruities: large herds of smelly hogs and elegant planters and their families. By referencing their elegant or often genteel accommodations, tavern keepers sought to appeal not just to the well-heeled men, but to women and families specifically on the move. Bolstering tavern's appeal to women during the period of my study was a transformation in American drinking. Simply put, this graph, the data from which comes from a classic text on drinking in the early Republic, Rohrabaugh's Alcoholic Republic. In the late 18th century, Americans drank a lot. In the early 19th century, they drank even more. And then in the 1830s and 1840s, alcohol consumption plummets. Not all Americans quit drinking, of course, but many cut back their drinking entirely or greatly. And a significant number joined temperance societies. To take a local example, Red Hook had 2 such societies, totaling perhaps 70 members in 1832. The secretary of the youth society, by the way, was an Edmund Elmendorf. This change in drinking patterns created a market for a new kind of tavern, the temperance tavern, especially in the northern states. Temperance taverns served no alcohol or served only beer and wine, depending on which kind of temperance they were practicing. But otherwise, they provided the services and amenities of what I call an improved tavern. These were typically larger, better furnished, and offered more separation between tavern guests and the tavern household, and also, again, between different kinds of activities than the most basic taverns could aspire to. And this image here, let's see, I'll give you a chance to look at this. So for example, Benjamin Balcom in East Attleboro will keep all kinds of liquors of the best quality except ardent spirits. And even in 1831, he's calling that a temperance tavern. And this other example, again, is talking about a tavern without the use of ardent spirits. And I think the language that says he will endeavor that every suitable attention will be paid to all those citizens and travelers which shall honor him with their custom, suggesting again that he's appealing both to people passing through and to locals living in the area who want tavern amenities but without the drugs. Or just the heavy drinking. I should just distinguish between the behavior and sort of the identity. It's important then too. Okay, so this image here is another way of thinking about improved taverns. This shows the plan and elevation of the Eagle Tavern in Watkinsville, Georgia, which is basically east of Atlanta, near the town of Athens, if you're familiar with that. That's where the University of Georgia is. And this was originally a 2-room structure with a store and a tavern. And then in the 1830s, the then owner wrapped an entirely new expansion around the basic 2-room plan, which for the first time allowed the keeper to offer multiple bedrooms, a separate dining room, and also an extensive front porch, which is shown in the front there. This place where we're sitting shows different evidence of improvements over time from what I've been informed and what your website shows. This was never a one-room tavern, but the owners added improvements and refinements over time, altering and expanding its spatial and social capacity. So again, we have images from original rooms that were remodeled to make them more elegant. So what is estimated to be an 1803-ish fireplace, at least according to your website, a federal fireplace added to an existing room, and then additional rooms, the one we're sitting in, and then the kitchen room added in a series of renovations over time, which again increased the capacity of the inn overall, but also increased its ability to separate groups of people, whether for actual events or simply for a kind of social filtering of different groups of people. So taverns invested in things like private bedrooms, parlors, and other enhancements, both to improve their own living arrangements and to make their accommodations appeal more to travelers who associated updated furnishings and privacy with a variety of desirable things, such as safety, comfort, and refined personal habits. These changes were especially likely in taverns that were well situated to take advantage of increased passenger travel. And speaking of travel, here we have examples of two of the many newspaper advertisements documenting the link between changes in commercial transportation and taverns. Keepers were crucial partners for stagecoach lines, for example, and sometimes direct investors. Taverns fed and watered stagecoach horses and furnished drivers and passengers with meals and shelter. When a tavern broke down, when the stagecoach broke down, the tavern keeper was often the one who found the blacksmith, who would mend the traces, mend the harnesses, reshoe the horses, whatever needed to be done. The Hudson and Pittsfield line ad shows how stagecoaches made regular use of taverns as places to stop, pick up travelers, sell tickets. So here, again, you have the Russell's Coffee House in Pittsfield, stopping in Lenox and Stockbridge, the Great Barrington Post Office, Egremont, Reed Stage House in Hillsdale. So in this case, there are more stops than there are taverns mentioned. On longer routes, each stop would be often a tavern, typically, because again, of the human and animal needs of the people associated with that traffic. Both the Hudson and Pittsfield line and the Skinner's accommodation stage on the other side emphasize the ability to connect to other lines. And this is where I think we see what you might call the densification of infrastructure, particularly in places like the Hudson Valley and much of New England in this period. They emphasize the ability to connect to other stagecoach lines and also to steamboats on the river. In their early years, railroads also made use of taverns as passenger depots and watering engines. The very early locomotives can only get about 15 miles before they re-water, and many of them in their early test years are using taverns for these purposes as well. So taverns are thus constituent parts of this transportation evolution we see in the early 19th century. So this interdependence between taverns and travel means that this image, which some of you may have seen before, illustrates the ways in which taverns remain great places to get information. This painting shows over here the mail carrier with the mail sack on his bag, coming in with mail and newspapers, being greeted by people who may well have been waiting there for his arrival. This image also shows newspapers on the wall, there, and then a writing desk in the corner. The image is a little bit dark, so I'm sorry the detail isn't as clear as it might be. This painting thus captures some of the ways that taverns nurtured both face-to-face communities and connected them with the wider world through oral communication, people in the stagecoach, for example, and then written communication as well. Kribbel's painting also suggests how taverns assemble people from different walks of life. In addition to showing a family group in the center and men of different ages, we see an older gentleman with glasses reading a newspaper, for example, and this man over here in the corner is a younger man, sort of younger, middle-aged men in the center. We also see criminal using attire to suggest a variety of occupations and social positions. Mixing with strangers in different walks of life was a great way to gather diverse information if you were visiting a tavern, but it was not always easy to get the information you wanted. A tavern visitor might, for example, be looking for information about the quality and price of local lands if they were thinking about moving to a new place. But he might hear nothing but the election. As a young man, that's a quote from the letter. As a young man, Roberts Vaux of Philadelphia observed, "At this time, every man is up to his armpits in politics." And he was traveling, not for political reasons, but trying to get, again, economic information in the context of land titles and other kinds of information in a trip through Pennsylvania. Visiting Charleston around the same time, a visiting man from Great Britain noted that if a man did not want to risk his life at 9 paces, he should hold his tongue, as nothing is more common than an appeal to pistols. Even in New England, where a couple decades later, by which point middle-class norms of masculinity had significantly devalued violence among men, not entirely, but significantly, young or brash travelers could get into trouble, as New York City's Abram Hewitt and his friend Edward Cooper learned during a 21st birthday tour of New England. We don't know exactly how the cosmopolitan pair irritated the regulars at a rural tavern near Dover, New Hampshire, but they did. Hewitt wrote that the villainous-looking keeper of this tavern seemed as likely to knock us down as to pick his teeth, combining the characteristics of the bulldog and the cutthroat. One of the patrons grabbed Hewitt and Cooper's hefty walking sticks and commenced a sweeping invective against aristocrats. Afraid of being pegged as one of those aristocrats and perhaps beaten with his own stick, Hewitt launched into a general eulogy on laborers and Democrats to appease this ferocious gentleman. The journal of another New Yorker, Sarah Howland, suggests more pleasant travels, but it also raises questions. Sarah journaled her way through several family trips to Philadelphia, to Connecticut, Rhode Island, Niagara Falls, and the Hudson Valley. During each trip, she rated the taverns they stayed at. A sample of her Hudson Valley journal reads, "Visiting Chappaqua Springs, Brewster's Inn, a very good house. Went to Peekskill and stayed that night at Coulter's Hotel, a poor place. Rode a few miles to breakfast, reached Fishkill and slept at Ackerley's, a most miserable place." As the wife of a prosperous New York man of business, Sarah Howland took for granted her right to patronize taverns and judge them. But what's curious about this journal is that she wrote as if she and her family were the only guests in every wayside tavern she visited. And she made no mention of tavern spaces at all, whether bedrooms or bar rooms. On a busy route in the summer, she could not have avoided encountering other leisure travelers or men patronizing their local taverns. As the image I suggested, this is where I have an issue with, there we go. As this image I picked from the book's cover suggests. So Sarah Howland is telling a story, even in her diary, about her tavern trips, her tavern sojourns. So although the Elmendorf didn't apparently ever have an extensive porch, porches were a very common feature in early 19th century taverns. And the ways that men typically used them created an uncomfortable environment for respectable women to move through. Men are sitting and lounging in very informal postures. They would not sit this way in the presence of a lady, quote-unquote lady. You can see here the piazza of Congress Hall in Saratoga Springs, 1830, which has, again, well-dressed ladies and men in what historians would call a heterosocial space, a space for respectable mingling of men and women. But this porch here and this porch from the Buckhorn Tavern in New York suggests a more masculine sort of space. Taverns that offered private bedrooms or parlors made it possible for women travelers to limit their exposure to such behaviors once they crossed the threshold. But by welcoming these women at all, these taverns created even more moments for competing visions of good behavior to come into conflict. At the same time, taverns that offered these differentiations created valuable opportunities for the subset of men who could easily move back and forth between talking with the ladies in the parlor and talking rough with the men in the bar room, for example. And there were also opportunities, too, for men who didn't want to drink and smoke and carouse and blaspheme in the bar, and were just as happy to have the excuse of going to be with the ladies in the parlor, for example. Now, if we widen our lens to consider the small but significant presence of Black Americans, interestingly, one such is figured in this painting, we add yet another dimension to the relationship between taverns, travel, and everyday citizenship. It must be said that taverns were in the main terribly grim places for Black Americans, especially the enslaved. Throughout the South, enslaved people labored in taverns, were bought and sold there, and suffered many forms of public and private violence, including rape, mutilation, and sometimes actual death. Even when individuals themselves did not experience these things, they often bore witness. Very occasionally, however, enslaved people used the tavern changes that I've been talking about, the changes in space and culture, in their own bids for freedom. Consider young Jermaine Logan, who escaped from a plantation south of Nashville with a friend. Unusually, the pair of young men had horses and money, and their plan was to pose as free people of color. At least twice before they crossed the Ohio River, they stopped at taverns. In both cases, the bar rooms were literally filled with white men in all stages of intoxication. At all costs, the two young Black men needed to avoid any confrontation with these drunken white men, so they asked for and received the use of a private parlor. While the bellowing of the crazy and drunken men kept them awake overnight, their seclusion, a product of genteel culture and tavern improvements, kept them safe. Now I want to pivot back to local patrons, who were in fact the majority of tavern patrons. What did taverns mean to them? Unsurprisingly, tavern account books suggest that, in fact, taverns meant liquor, and lots of it. Take the case of Martin Brown, a tavern keeper in Northern Virginia. In 1803-1804, for example, nearly 90% of his tavern sales involved alcohol, and he sold almost no lodgings or meals or food for horses. But like many keepers of his sort at the period, he traded in far more than tavern goods. More than 40% of his patrons bought foodstuffs such as vinegar, molasses, and sugar, basic household essentials for a kitchen. Almost a fifth of his patrons owed him for textiles and cloth. And Brown accepted payment in many forms: in labor, in promissory notes, and in cash, which facilitated the flow of agricultural products, manufactured goods, and credit throughout his neighborhood. But a tavern did not become a major community institution simply by doubling as a store. Entrepreneurial locals also came to taverns to introduce innovations into local economies. Sometimes these innovations had to do with infrastructure, like building turnpike roads. So here we have a couple of notices about turnpikes and their intersections with taverns. Even before turnpike companies were incorporated, communities often gathered in their local taverns to create the political will behind petitions to allow for incorporations, to call for roads to be drawn this way and not that way, in ways that would benefit the community. These were highly political processes in which tavern keepers themselves were very motivated participants. Increased road traffic past their doors was going to be crucial for them as well as others in their towns. Taverns that hosted one kind of forward-looking group, like infrastructure companies, often hosted others, like agricultural societies. And it was no surprise to me, for example, to learn that the Elmendorf Inn played host to the Dutchess and Columbia County Agricultural Society in that society's formative years. Taverns also hosted insurance company meetings. Learning to think strategically about risk was an important part of economic innovation in the early 19th century. Taverns hosted dancing societies, which was far from a frivolous activity in a context when dancing and the connections made through dancing represented an important form of social capital. In addition, town taverns hosted traveling performers and entertainments. It wasn't all serious, such as the Grand Caravan, a group that was transporting wild animals of various sorts across New England in the 1820s and 1830s. These entrepreneurial uses of taverns often took place in the very same taverns that government officials patronized for public business. Again, another thing that was happening here in the Elmendorf in the early 19th century. In dozens of new counties and hundreds of new towns and villages, Courts, jails, and town meetings were temporarily held in taverns, or in the case of town meetings, held in taverns for decades, in fact. State legislators and local election officials also designated taverns as polling places, linking tavern going with that most visible and widespread act of political belonging in the early republic. The overlap between taverns and government, while not entirely new, expanded the traditional meanings of the public house, making taverns into houses for the Republican polity as much as for the traveling public. White men routinely celebrated the 4th of July in taverns, drinking toasts in honor of liberty and independence. But taverns could also be a place to gather against the government. In Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maine, for example, public discontent with great landlords and unresponsive state legislatures led to major outbreaks of resistance in the late 18th and early 19th century. In each case, taverns provided far more than liquid courage. They presented places to recruit and organize collective resistance. In 1808, for example, a deputy sheriff came to visit a Maine tavern because of rumors it was the unofficial headquarters of people who were planning to storm the Capitol and interrupt court proceedings against people who were being called squatters by the proprietors. When the deputy sheriff arrived at Broad's Tavern, he found a crowd of some 400 men, including several dozen who were both armed and masked. Despite their threatening presence, however, the deputy sheriff reported later that, quote, the utmost order and regularity was observed among them the whole day. Now that phrase is often used to describe July 4th celebrations. Its use here, I think, suggests that the deputies saw some legitimacy in this self-constituted gathering or knew that his neighbors would. It mattered that taverns remained places to test and temper public opinion in opposition to elected authority after the Constitution was ratified, because many of the founders believed that with the end of the Revolution and with the ratification of the Constitution, they had closed the book on the Revolution and its tactics. In this view, the role of the Republican electorate was simply to elect representatives, allow those representatives to rule, and then elect new ones if they disapproved of those representatives' actions. In fact, despite James Madison's expectation that the Republic's great size would impede factionalism, ordinary tradesmen, artisans, and farmers, as well as wealthy and well-educated men, quickly started gathering in taverns and other places to discuss local, state, and national issues, figure out who they wanted to support, and sometimes to suggest course corrections to sitting representatives. By the end of the 1790s, both the Washingtonian Federalists and their Republican opponents regularly held tavern meetings at which ordinary voters practiced what were increasingly understood as everyday political skills in a republic: deliberating upon men and measures, crafting resolutions to appeal to a wider public, forming committees to accomplish specific tasks, and building strategies and procedures to maintain the momentum. This kind of political activity was not reserved exclusively for white men. Pre-election organizing attracted black electors as well, as we can see here in some New York City newspapers. Black Federalists met at a couple different lower Manhattan taverns at the beginning of the 19th century, discussing elections and President Thomas Jefferson's policies. And one of my particularly favorite lines refers to their critiquing Thomas Jefferson's trade embargo, which they refer to as the result of executive imbecility and foreign influence. No comment. So contrary to our long-held assumptions that the early 19th century is the era of white manhood suffrage, it's important to note that black men continued to vote in multiple states, and while their numbers were small, their votes actually mattered. In the 1820s, moving ahead, village and town taverns became critical organizing spaces in what turned out to be a really critical decade of realignment. In 1824, voters held meetings at locally important taverns, north and south, where they could get basic information about presidential elections, or nominate candidates, or participate in overt partisan organization, as the excerpt from this Haverhill newspaper suggests. Because of meetings like these, when Andrew Jackson was elected to the presidency 4 years later in 1828, his supporters had reason to believe that they had helped make the democracy from the ground up. It's worth mentioning, though, that tavern meetings weren't exclusive to Jackson men. John Quincy Adams' supporters had also participated in many tavern meetings, forming committees and sending delegates to conventions, some of which are represented in the Baltimore clip from 1828. Also important in shaping the political climate of the 1820s and afterwards was the growing reality that, as Alexis de Tocqueville noted, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. As I mentioned before, Americans worked together to build turnpike roads and improve agriculture and manufacturing. Both men and women formed and joined associations to support, for example, education and poor relief, and to promote more radical causes such as temperance and anti-slavery. Many of these associations drafted constitutions and resolutions, elected officers, and had regular meetings. And a surprising variety of them, in fact, met in taverns. Although doctors were among some of the earliest and loudest voices condemning excessive drinking, some early New England medical societies held their meetings in taverns. So that's the one up there from the Berkshire Journal. The occasional temperance society met in taverns, a further demonstration of the new temperance niche in public accommodations, or it just gross incongruity. It's hard to tell which sometimes. Missionary societies collected at least a small amount of money from collecting boxes left in some taverns and hotels. The most radical of the anti-slavery societies usually convened in churches and town halls and those kinds of spaces, but their meetings also sometimes took place in town taverns. I found one case in Kentucky, for example, and then here's a case also from Concord, Massachusetts. Abolitionists faced an unusually high risk of verbal abuse or physical violence at their lectures and meetings and just during their travels. At its worst in the late 1830s, anti-abolitionist violence extended to murder, riot, and arson that especially targeted Black individuals and communities. In the 1840s and 1850s, open violence was less common, but even in the temperance hotels and taverns that tended to welcome white abolitionists, Black abolitionists often found distinctly second-class hospitality. At Boston's Marlborough Hotel, known for its temperance platform and anti-slavery patrons, the Black performer Mary Webb, she was a spoken, I was going to say spoken word artist, but that really is too contemporary a term, but she would give recitations from dramas and poetry. For example, she could get a room at the Marlborough House in Boston, but she was barred from both the dining room and from the on-site religious services. As Frederick Douglass put it in his newspaper, the management refused to treat her as a woman and a sister, which was a common abolitionist phrase at the time. But what I want you to notice here is that the news of Mary Webb's ill treatment made it to an Ohio newspaper, an anti-slavery newspaper, which mentioned by name both the hotel which treated her badly, the Marlborough House, and another hotel, the Winthrop, which welcomed her. Black abolitionist publishers in the 1840s and 50s seized every opportunity to name and shame taverns and hotels which mistreated Black travelers and instructed their readers to patronize other establishments, like, for example, the American Hotel and Durham House in Cleveland, Ohio, which treated Black travelers with the respect and attention commonly paid to other travelers. The occasions that brought Black men and women to hotels and taverns at mid-century, meanwhile, were often overtly political. They were giving anti-slavery lectures or traveling to abolition conventions. By the 1850s, in short, access to public accommodations remained an important index of citizenship. In 1855, Alabama attorney Charles P. Robinson made the point in a lawsuit about tavern keepers' liability for lost property. In the United States, he argued, a common language, common ideas, common laws, the habit of traveling, equal knowledge, and an active intelligence have clothed the traveler with a citizenship wherever his journey leads him. Robinson was as correct about travel's significance as he was wrong in suggesting that all travelers were equally clothed in citizenship. Just a few years before, Southerners in Congress had ensured that Black and white Northerners had to reassess their position in the Republic. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 told white Northerners that they could be forced to assist federal marshals in capturing alleged fugitives and rendering them to slavery. Under the same law, judges were paid $10 if they consigned a supposed fugitive to slavery, and only $5 if they restored them to freedom. And anybody who was accused of being a fugitive was barred from testifying in their own defense. The act thus told Black Northerners, even those born free, that they would not receive meaningful due process if they were apprehended. As at any historical inflection point, resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act crisis took many forms. Some African Americans emigrated to Canada and Britain and other places. Some white and Black Americans overtly resisted efforts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act or formed militias in preparation to do so. Eventually, the New Republican Party would form, forged out of the pressure that the so-called slave power was said to be putting on Northerners' freedom of speech, their movement, their freedom of assembly, their political choices, and even their economic prospects. In 2025, there is no direct analogy to early 19th century taverns. No single institution, public or private, combines all the functions that were once common to thriving town and village taverns. Instead, we have many different public places, some commercial, such as modern convention centers, and some nonprofit, as our vital public libraries. And we have new categories of privately owned spaces that operate as public places in a limited set of ways, such as shopping malls. But one key continuity is that for today's citizens, whether you can safely and easily access these public spaces, either in your own neighborhoods or while traveling across the country, continues both to reflect and to shape your personal freedom, your economic horizons, and your political efficacy. Thank you.
Thank you. We'd like to do Q&A now, and if we could just repeat the questions back into the microphone so that those on Zoom can also hear.
Okay, so it looks like you in the room get the prerogative. Yes?
Was there any distinction between the term inn and tavern, or just used interchangeably?
Good question. The question was whether there was any distinction between inn and tavern, or whether they're used interchangeably. So this is a classic historian's answer: it depends, or it's complicated. So yes and no. Inn has some regional patterning, but not necessarily a specifically different meaning. In the UK, an inn is, that term is used for the places that are for travelers, and in some cases that usage persists in the US, but it's not a legally rigid definition, and it's totally absent in many state laws. Tavern laws are, by definition, state laws in this period. So some places will say tavern or inn, using them interchangeably. Some places will try to make a distinction between them. Some travelers will use the word inn to refer to a place where they are staying overnight, or to refer to a place that feels better to them. It does feel more comfortable, whatever comfortable means to them. There's, again, some regional usage. It's not used as much in the South as it is in the northern states. So classically, again, yes and no.
Follow up on that question of terminology. You've got hotel coming in, and then in an earlier period we have the demarcation between someone's house and a tavern, although sometimes it seems difficult to tell the difference between those two things. Could you talk a little bit about the earlier evolution of terminology from so-and-so's house, a place to stay at, to tavern, and then the advent of hotels, I think you said early 19th century.
Right. So the question was about terminology, again, about houses, taverns, hotels, as different ways of thinking about what I'll call broad public accommodations. So, there's a couple different things wrapped up in there that I'm going to try to unpack. One piece is the unlicensed tavern, the housekeeper who does not have a license to keep tavern, who may nonetheless provide alcohol, provide meals to travelers on an as-demanded sort of basis, with no legal authority to do so, that person is not obliged to take travelers who come to their door because they don't hold a license. They are not obliged to follow the price lists that are common, that are not as common there everywhere that I've found, that are regulating what tavern keepers can charge for alcohols and for lodgings and for horse feed. They are less common in more settled areas, it seems, because the local officials want to make sure that tavern keepers pay the license fees, because that's part of, sometimes a significant part of county budgets. So you have the unofficial tavern keepers who are just householders. Then the house of, so you might have Smith's house, Allen's house, Moffat's house, or just in the newspaper, just Moffat's, Allen's, Smith's. And as you read more and more newspapers and travel letters and travel narratives, you realize that that often means a tavern without any other word following it. So if they're having a meeting of the Republicans in the North District of wherever at Jones's is probably a tavern. And so I've often gone back and cross-referenced. Can I find that Jones's is advertised specifically as a tavern somewhere else? Yes, okay, so I can confirm. And you do that enough times and you get pretty confident that Jones's and Smith's and Allen's and Ned Ness's or whatever are all taverns. And that, it's not entirely clear that people are avoiding the word tavern. It may be as simple as everybody knows. Like, you don't say, I am going to the Green Giant grocery store. Like, I'm going to the IGA. I'm not going to the IGA grocery store. I'm not going to the big white grocery store. You don't necessarily need to fill it out. So that, it might be as simple as that. But there may also be a sense that the word tavern, in some contexts, is, I'll use the word déclassé. Hotel is an interesting one. So there are some scholars who made an argument that a hotel represents a fundamentally new kind of public accommodation, and I disagree. The word hotel is used often to mean something that is simply a bigger, better tavern than average, a tavern with pretensions, and what is particularly delightful is when you see someone describing a place they've stayed. The so-and-so hotel in such a place. This is a really second-rate tavern. So I see the owner, the proprietor, the keeper, calling itself a hotel, and I am bringing them down a peg. Then you also have cases where it's, for example, the place might be called the Drovers Hotel. Again, drovers are the men who are moving large herds of livestock around the landscape. This is not a, it's an anachronistic term. This is not a white-collar occupation. This is something that you might do for a while as a young man and then go on to become a man of substance, but it is not something you're doing because you are trained as a lawyer and have a lot of money, for example. But Drover's Hotel is, again, a suggestion that this is something about the size or scale of it, not necessarily refinement. So hotel is complicated. And a lot of the larger, fancier places don't even use the word hotel, they might use house instead. So house comes back. So, like I said before, it's complicated, and people are trying to work out ideas about status, ideas about respectability, ideas about drinking. But one of the things that I think is important to note is that hotel does not exist as a legal category in this period. There is no such thing as a hotel distinct from a tavern in this period. They're just starting to begin to think about it in the law at mid-century.
We have a question back here.
Yeah, hi.
So, how did you get interested in taverns? And one other really short one I just thought of that I've been thinking of because I thought it would be interesting. So how did you get interested in taverns, and what would life have been like for a family who owned a tavern?
Great questions. How did I get interested in taverns? Well, it was not because that I thought it would be a lot of fun to sit around in historic bars and drink, which is what everybody typically thinks. And there was, in fact, literally none of that, sitting around in historic bars and drinking. I got interested in them because my first book was a book about women in the South in the same period who were widows who owned slaves. And one of the things that I argued is that their ability to be effective in that position in a time when ideas about male-female authority or such that many people said, both historians in the present and people of the past, said that women couldn't manage slaves, women couldn't manage plantations, and I found that the fact that the plantation house or the farmhouse was a place of business was one of the reasons that helped women do what they could do as widows. There were many other reasons as well, and in fact, more recent work has showed that even married women were able to do more of this than we used to think. Why did that connect to taverns? Because it got me interested in the places where multiple things are happening, where people are living and they're also doing business. And so I started to think about other places where that happens, and the taverns are the perfect example of a place where people live and a place where people are doing business. And so that, in fact, leads perfectly into your question, which is what it was like for tavern families. I wrote a piece that didn't inform this, it doesn't appear in this book, about precisely what it was like to be a tavern-keeping family, particularly in the South. And it was hard. It's hard work, particularly if you're in a place where there's a lot of people coming and going. Stagecoaches in this period might be coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. They come to pick up passengers at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so you are having to be awake and serving people at crazy hours. They often don't treat you nicely. You might think that you are a respectable family doing a respectable job, but the people coming through might treat you as tainted, as suspect in your morals because you're associated with alcohol and with people passing through. And so it's complicated. If you are a young woman, you would often be lectured at by the young men who think it's their complete prerogative to be talking about the pretty barmaids. And talking about pretty barmaids, fine, no problem. But it didn't always stop with just talking. So it was definitely hard. But it also could be a way for at least the men in the family to become locally really quite influential. So depending on whether you were a child, depending on your sex, depending on how successful your tavern was, it would be more or less difficult. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah. Two things. We had pubs in England.
Yes.
What was the transition from pub to tavern and from tavern to saloon?
Yeah. So the English pub does not provide accommodations for travelers. That's what the English inn does. And so in England, they are legally and socially distinct institutions. In the colonial period of American history, taverns are doing both. And what happens is that legislators basically come up with a kind of quid pro quo, some scholars have described it. You have the right to sell alcohol by the drink, even though we know that could introduce some disorder into the community, in exchange for providing this valuable public service of hosting travelers, so that we also then know where the travelers are going to be. We know that they'll have a place to be, and we know where to find them if we need them. So those functions are merged. The pub and the inn, in the English sense, are merged in the American sense. And some taverns are mostly pubs in that sense, in the sense that they mostly have local customers. And some taverns are mostly inns in the English sense, in that they mostly serve travelers. And some of them are, again, in this middle space where they do a lot of both. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to put the question into the microphone. It was about pubs and inns. And then saloons, yes. So
Because our image of the saloon is based on old Western movies that we all saw.
So the saloon, this is really interesting. The saloon, what happens in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, I started to allude to this. We're talking about hotels. We start to get more and more specialization in the public accommodation sector. So we have places that are increasingly advertised, for example, specifically as first-class hotel, second-class hotel, third-class hotel, suggesting that you can buy accommodations that fit your price point. The price lists that used to regulate what tavern keepers could charge start to evaporate. and it may be that they still have fixed prices they can charge for liquor, but the accommodations part starts to get differentiated. At the same time, there is also a growth first in large cities, then in smaller ones, of the commercial entertainment sector. So instead of going to the tavern to see the Grand Caravan come to town, the wild animal show, and anything else that comes to town, you start having dedicated spaces for entertainment. So you go and pay your 25 cents at a place that's doing entertainments all the time. It's just a theater. It's just a stage for performances of different kinds. And then you have things like ice cream shops or confectionaries showing up, which are meant to be alcohol-free places that you would go, and you can't sleep there unless they're running a prostitution ring as well, which often happens, and then you're not sleeping, but I know it's so you have this institution which used to house all of these things, having its functions being pulled off in different directions. You start seeing ordinances, city ordinances, which are regulating alcohol at the mid-century, starting to list not just taverns, but taverns and gardens and museums and saloons and all these kinds of other places that can or can't do certain things. So there's just a proliferation of places you can go. In part of that, what happens is that the saloon then typically stops doing the housing people function and becomes more like the bar only, which is something that Americans for a long time had not wanted to do because it seemed to be encouraging alcohol too much. So Americans' love-hate relationship with alcohol is really evident in here. But there's so much need for temporary accommodations that becomes its own thing. It becomes increasingly separate from the place where you gather to drink and socialize, and these things just get pulled apart in the 19th century. So it's not the Western image that we see with like the swinging doors and the high kicking dancers and then the gunfight that you see in Act 2 of the movie. But you do have these saloons where they will provide a free lunch in the late 19th century to get you in the door to buy your drinks. And then that becomes a place where the democratic political machine is really operating out of these kinds of saloons, which grow out of taverns. And then at the same time, old-style taverns are still existing in smaller communities. Their services to travelers are increasingly being taken on by other businesses, like I suggested, but some of their old functions as places for communities to gather and do a variety of things socially, civically, politically still exist. They're becoming attenuated, but they do still exist. That was a really long answer, so I hope in fact I actually answered your question.
Thank you.
I'm not sure who was first, so let's go.
Okay. I'm just wondering, is there a distinction between the liquor license for a shop or a store versus the inn?
Yes, the shopkeeper can sell alcohol, but not by the drink. Yes. Now, what counts as a drink is an interesting question. Basically, a pint and a half pint is a drink. Also smaller measures too, but generally a quart and up is what a store can sell typically, and below a quart is what a tavern keeper can sell. A very common drink being served in this period is a 4-ounce pour, but half pints and full pints are also very common.
I was wondering because we have a situation in one of the towns in Dutchess County that was a store and an inn and a residence. It doesn't get labeled as a tavern that I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And another layer on that is that the owner, the proprietor, was Quaker. So, but he sold rum. Wow.
Quakers don't not drink. They're not Baptists.
That's true. We find a lot of diversity with them.
In the front here?
When did price regulation end?
That is a good question, and I have not been able to figure out in any very clear way. So I did not try to track it down. For example, I didn't say, let's pick a state and figure out when it actually ends. The latest ones that I've seen for sure, 1830s, which is 40 years later than some people have thought they extended. So they're active. The question is a little bit whether they're enforced. And again, like I suggested earlier, whether they increasingly apply only to liquor or apply also, as they originally did, to lodgings. And it seems that just as a practical matter, there's no way that the differentiations we start to see can have existed without the category of lodging being interpreted as mere shelter to make it possible to charge more for a private bedroom and all the additional amenities that people start to offer. Otherwise, it's not affordable to invest in those things. But yeah, I know that's a difficult question because the authorizing statutes that say local authorities or different kinds, usually county level authorities, have to pass these price lists. I haven't been able to find any laws that say those are now repealed. So I think what happens is that it tends to run into prohibitory legislation. So you start seeing state level laws regulating alcohol in new ways, and I think those end up in practice superseding the price laws. But again, that is something that I'm still trying to sort out. One of the things I'd like to do as a next project is to look at a particular hotel keeper, actually the one who was hosting an anti-slavery society in Concord, Massachusetts. I had an advertisement for that up. He his hotel hosts a number of anti-slavery societies, but then a couple of years later, he's on trial for breaking Massachusetts' liquor law. And I would just love to be able to trace sort of his case, and that might be an entree into figuring out what's going on in Massachusetts, at least in particular, about this transition with price regulation. So it's a good question, but it's a tricky one. There was a question in the back, I think, over there.
Yeah, when I think of an innkeeper, I think about the master of the house, Les Mis, and his wife. Do you have any comments about that particular innkeeper?
So saying the master of the house and...
Les Miserables.
Oh. Golly. I haven't seen Les Mis since I was an undergraduate a very long time ago.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Well, it's back.
Yeah.
He was a rather rowdy gentleman.
Right. So the question was about the master of the house figure in Les Mis, which I had to confess I don't remember particularly. I remember the song, but don't remember the But there is a lot to be said about this, particularly the relationship between the master of the house, the landlord and the landlady, as is often that's often described as in the period. The question we had before about what it was like to be a tavern keeper's family speaks to this as well. One of the things I found is that sometimes the lady of the house is the one who actually is interacting with the customers more because the man is off keeping the farm. He's doing farm work, for example, or he's got another business that he's taking care of while she is staying local. So that the fact that women's work is often tied to the house makes it easier for her to be present for the tavern patrons, which raises some interesting questions when most of the patrons are men, and that can get a little bit complicated. In terms of adversarial relationships, there's one particular one that I enjoy talking about, described by a character herself as someone who becomes, in a sense, the first female American travel writer, Anne Newport Royal, and she describes a tavern, I forget which southern state she's in at the time, where the man of the house, the keeper of the house, has hired or maybe bought an Afro-Cherokee woman to be the cook, and the wife is really mad that she is there in her kitchen, and so there's really evident ill will between the cook, the wife, the tavern keeper, and then the guests are all kind of horrified or enraptured spectators to this three-way quarrel, and whether in fact he's actually bought this woman to be his sexual partner, as well as the tavern cook, is another thing, another speculation we ought to entertain. That's about all I can say on that front.
Yes. Was there any distinction between like an inn and a rooming house, so limiting the amount of time that someone can stay at an inn?
Good question. No, I've never seen any regulation limiting how long we can stay in an inn. The difference between a tavern and a boarding house in this period is that boarding houses aren't public. They're not legally public, and they're not allowed to sell alcohol to any passersby. So if I'm keeping a boarding house, I get to discriminate among my customers. I want you as my boarder. I don't want you. I'm pointing to people in the audience, to those who can't see. I'll take you. I won't take you. You look really rowdy, and because I'm going to keep a refined boarding house, for example. And then I can serve you alcohol, wine with the meals if I want, if you're willing to pay for it. But I'm keeping a private boarding house, and not anybody off the street can come. A tavern must, in theory, take any traveler, because travelers aren't supposed to be out in the cold. They could die. It could be winter in New England, whatever. In practice, of course, if you are Black, or if you are a woman who is obviously pregnant and has no obvious husband, you could be turned away. All kinds of reasons on the phone may be turned away. But legally, you can't turn anybody away as a tavern keeper unless you are absolutely stuck to the rafters, or the person is obviously diseased. And diseased is the word they use. There are a couple other things that they can use, but that's the main distinction. Boarding houses are private. Yes?
With that in mind, the point about these taverns being public.
Yes.
Did you run across stories of, we have such a sense of customer service, and I paid for this room and it's mine, and it seems as though, would it be, this may be far-fetched, but would being stuck at JFK overnight and sleeping on a bench at JFK, is there an analogy there, or am I taking that too far? In the sense of, I paid for my bed, but at 3 a.m, 2 other guys came in the bed too. Like they arrived and jumped in the bed as well. I mean, is that accurate?
Yes. The question was about whether you could make a comparison between whether a modern idea is about the privacy you're entitled to when you get a hotel room do not apply, and whether it's more like being stuck overnight in JFK, making the best as you can of whatever space you could find in the concourse. And the answer is basically yes. So beds are shared, rooms are shared. You don't get to say no unless you've managed to pay for the privacy. And this is the place where they're operating in a gray zone. There's no law that says you can, if you pay double, have the bed to yourself. You can, if you pay triple, have the room to yourself. It doesn't work that way, but we start to see our places that will have, for example, barracks-style rooms or bunk rooms with maybe 6 or 12 beds in a room. Often those beds might be double-stacked with men, sometimes triple-stacked. And then there'll be another room which is for single ladies or ladies traveling alone. So if you're a family, you might be in the bunk room still, but like single ladies traveling alone might be in a special room. And so there start to be differentiations that have something to do with ideas about sex and gender, something to do with availability of money. Some places start to advertise things like, we have this many rooms and 3 of them are private apartments, each with a separate staircase. That's from, I think, Fairfax County, Virginia. So there's just really different ideas, and basically it becomes a question in part of money, but also in part of crowding. So if it's court time, if the legislature is in session, it could be senators stacked up on the floor. It could be when we're evacuating Philadelphia in 1793 because of the yellow fever epidemic. Thomas Jefferson is in a tavern outside of Philadelphia somewhere, and he's complaining because the only bed is in a public room. It's sort of in the equivalent of the bar room in this small tavern. And the tavern keeper is like, you can take that, or you can sleep on the floor. It makes me no never mind. And Jefferson is writing indignant letters to James Madison and another one of his friends about this. So sometimes it doesn't matter how rich or how famous or how important you are, you're going to be sleeping on your coat on the floor.
This is a question from someone online asking requirements for providing parking for horses.
Yes. So that's another good one. About parking for horses or stabling for horses. Tavern keepers are required to accommodate a certain amount of travelers. They're not supposed to be able to accommodate infinity travelers. So typically the statutes will be written in a way that the licensee, the would-be licensee, has to demonstrate usually by having neighbors sign a document that attests that they have good and sufficient bedding for whatever the mandated number of travelers would be in their district. It might be 2, it might be 4, and then the number of horses might be 4 or 6. The number of horses is usually larger than the number of people because you have a 2-horse or 4-horse drawn carriage potentially. One of the things that's interesting is that in New York City in 1803, I think it is, I can't remember exactly, they started to realize that it's unrealistic in some of these really dense neighborhoods to have all that stabling with your taverns. And so they issue a waiver to the state law for New York City saying New York City tavern keepers don't have to offer stabling. At which point, everybody and their mother gets a tavern license. And then 15 years later, Mayor Varick is like, oh my goodness, we have like a tavern for every 15 people. That is way too, I'm making that number up, I can't remember the exact number, but we have way too many taverns. We have to do something about this. And this regulation that relaxed the horse stabling was part of the problem. So we need to fix that somehow. We see also, 20 years later in Michigan, I think it was, a similar kind of revision where that centers of population have their stabling requirements loosened and rural areas have to keep their stabling. One more question? One more question. Unless I've talked you all out.
Well, this doesn't have to do specifically with that, but I noticed in some of the things I was reading, and I've noticed this in the past, and I've never really gotten a straight answer. Sometimes it looks like the letter S is replaced by an F.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could say what that's about.
That is a function of the TypeScript of the time. It's a standard, and...
Because sometimes there's an S in the middle of a word, and sometimes it's an F.
So it has to do with...
That's like what the printed character looked like at that time in some typefaces.
Right, but why is in some cases and not in others. I think, so one of the things that sometimes, there's a better explanation for why it starts, but one of the things that's interesting about the early 19th century, which I can tell you about, so I'm going to evade your answer as well, evade your question a little bit as well, which is about the S that looks like an F in 18th and 19th century typography. So it is a part of the typography itself, but one of the interesting things about many of the smaller town newspapers that we see in this period is that those newspaper printers are often using secondhand type. And so that type is maybe worn, which is often why the newspapers from towns in the interior are often harder to read because the type itself is not fresh, and they also have lower quality paper. And so even when city papers have transitioned to the newer type, which have gotten rid of that S, and I forget what it's called, it's got a name, I'm just blanking what it's called, that particular FS. But the older, the smaller scale newspaper printers who are using old type are probably still using those old typefaces that have that F, even after printers in the big cities who can afford to replace their type are using only the new S. Not a great answer, but it's what I got.
Thank you.